So a man walks up to a monk and asks how much money he needs to retire, which already sounds like he's expecting a clean number instead of a slightly uncomfortable answer. A finish line, a plan, a sense of control, which is funny because humans love exact numbers, especially when those numbers quietly ignore everything that actually changes over time. So the monk pauses for a second and then asks him when exactly he plans to be poor, which is not the follow-up question people expect after hearing a number that comforting, because 2.5 million sounds like freedom. It's the number every calculator loves, every guru repeats, and every person quietly decides is enough without really questioning it. So the man frowns a little and asks how that number wouldn't be enough, and the monk, instead of answering directly, just quietly picks up something incredibly simple. He holds up the bowl and says, "Today this costs $1, and then just pauses long enough for the man to assume this is going to be a very simple explanation. And then the monk adds, "In 20 years, this same bowl will cost more," and suddenly this stops being about rice and starts becoming about something much more uncomfortable. So the monk asks him a very annoying question. Did the rice actually become better? Or did something else quietly change while you were busy trusting the number? Because the rice didn't change at all. Your money did. It just became weaker in a way that doesn't feel obvious until you try to actually use it. Which is when the monk explains that you're not actually saving money. You're trying to save purchasing power. And that's exactly where most people completely misunderstand what they're doing. Which means that 2.5 million number you're chasing right now is already quietly losing meaning over time. Even if it still looks big and comforting in your head, because money doesn't fail loudly. It just slowly loses what it can do for you, which is way more dangerous because you don't notice it until things start feeling more expensive. So even though your bank balance looks bigger over time, what it actually buys keeps shrinking, and that gap is where most retirement plans quietly fall apart. So let's actually run the math for a second. Assume inflation stays around 3%, which sounds small until you realize what it quietly does over a couple decades. Because over 25 years, that small percentage quietly cuts your money's value almost in half, which is not something most people factor into their perfect retirement number. So congratulations, you technically reached your goal, just in a version of money that can only do about half of what you originally expected. So the man says he'll just adjust his lifestyle when that happens. Which sounds reasonable until you remember people don't usually downgrade their life after spending decades upgrading it. You're not going to suddenly want less comfort, less security, or less convenience just because you stopped working. Because retirement doesn't magically reduce your expenses. It just removes your income, which is a slightly important detail most people prefer not to think about. So now the monk draws a simple idea. You take your savings and withdraw a small percentage every year, which on paper looks safe and predictable and completely under control. But then he asks what happens when things don't behave. Like when markets drop, prices rise faster, or life suddenly becomes more expensive than your neat little model assumed. Because at that point, you're not withdrawing a safe percentage anymore. You're slowly eating into your future, which is a much less comforting way to describe it. So the monk looks at him and says, the real problem isn't the number you picked. It's the way you're thinking about money as something you finish instead of something that continues. Because most people believe they'll save enough one day and then finally stop. Like money is some kind of checkpoint instead of a system that needs to keep working. And that's where people get stuck. Because wealth isn't a pile you build and sit on. It's a system that either keeps producing or slowly starts disappearing. So instead of asking how much money you need, the better question is how much your money can actually generate for you every single year without running out. So the man asks if he shouldn't chase the number anymore. And the monk just smiles again because that's not wrong, it's just incomplete in a way that matters. Because if your money can generate enough income consistently and adjust over time, then you're actually free. Not when you hit a number, but when you replace yourself. And the monk tells him you can chase the number if you want. Just understand that it's not a destination. It's something that keeps shifting while you're busy trying to reach it. Because while you're chasing it, inflation keeps moving it, life keeps changing it, and time keeps reducing how much room you have left to fix mistakes. Most people don't actually run out of money, they run out of time to correct the assumptions they built their entire plan on. And the biggest assumption of all is believing that one fixed number will somehow protect you from a system that is constantly changing underneath you. So the monk tells him, if your money doesn't grow, it slowly dies. And if your plan depends on something fixed, it eventually breaks under pressure. Ding! So instead of chasing a number that keeps moving, maybe it makes more sense to build something that can actually survive reality instead of assuming reality will behave the way you planned. So now the question isn't really how much money you need. It's what number you've been trusting this whole time, without actually checking if it still makes sense. Because most people aren't wrong about wanting security. They're just relying on a version of math that quietly stops working the moment reality shifts a little bit. So tell me what number you've been chasing this whole time, and more importantly, whether you've actually adjusted it for inflation, time, and everything else that doesn't stay still. And if you actually want to understand how money works without all the comfortable illusions, you can stick around, because the market doesn't really care about your goals, only your math, which is why even after hearing all this, most people still go back to chasing the same number, because it feels easier to believe in a target than to build something ongoing, because building a system means dealing with uncertainty, and people don't like that. They prefer a clean number, even if that number quietly ignores how unpredictable everything actually is. So even when the logic makes sense, people still default back to simple answers, because simple answers feel safer than dealing with something that actually requires ongoing attention. Because thinking in systems means accepting that things can go wrong, and most people would rather believe in a stable number than prepare for instability. So they lock onto a number and build their entire plan around it, even though that number is based on assumptions that are quietly changing every single year. And the dangerous part is nothing looks broken at first. Everything feels fine, until one day the gap between what you have and what you need becomes impossible to ignore, which is usually when people panic. Not because something suddenly changed, but because something that was changing slowly finally became visible all at once. So the monk doesn't try to convince him anymore, he just lets him sit with that realization. Because understanding money isn't about hearing the truth once, it's about seeing it repeatedly. Which is why the monk never really talks about exact numbers. Because numbers feel precise, but the system behind those numbers is what actually determines whether they work or not. Because the same number can either work perfectly or completely fail, depending on how your money behaves after you stop earning it. So chasing a number without understanding what happens after you reach it is kind of like planning a trip without knowing what happens when you arrive. Because reaching the number doesn't solve the problem, it just shifts the problem into a different form that most people haven't actually prepared for. And that's why people who hit their target still feel unsure, because deep down they know the system holding that number together isn't as stable as they hoped. So at some point, you either keep chasing numbers hoping they hold, or you start thinking differently and build something that actually adapts when things don't go the way you expect. Which is also why the same advice keeps repeating over and over, not because it's complicated, but because people keep ignoring it in favor of something that feels easier to follow. Because simple plans feel actionable, even if they're incomplete, while real systems require patience, adjustment, and accepting that things won't always behave the way you expect. So people keep moving forward thinking they're on track, while small changes underneath keep stacking up in ways that only become obvious much later. And by the time they finally question the plan, they've already committed so much time to it that changing direction feels harder than just continuing forward. Which is how people end up staying in plans that don't really work, not because they're good, but because they've already invested too much to comfortably change them. So the real question isn't whether your number is right, it's whether the way you're thinking about money is flexible enough to survive when things don't go exactly how you planned. Which is also why that original question sounds simple but isn't. Because asking how much you need ignores everything that determines whether that amount will actually be enough later. And that's why the monk never gave him a real answer. He just gave him a number that sounded complete enough to expose how incomplete the thinking actually was. Because once you believe a number is enough, you stop questioning it, and that's usually the moment your plan quietly stops adapting to reality. So the real risk isn't that you picked the wrong number, it's that you stopped updating your thinking once you picked one that felt comfortable enough, and by the time you realize something is off, you're no longer early in the process, which makes fixing the problem a lot harder than it needed to be. Which is why the monk never really cared about the number at all. He cared about whether the man understood how money actually behaves once he stops earning it. So if you go back to that original question, how much money do you need to retire? It's not really a question about money, it's a question about how well you understand it. Because the number is just the surface, what actually matters is whether your money can keep working when you stop, and most people never really test that part.
Click.
So think about it for a second. What number are you chasing right now? And more importantly, do you actually understand what has to happen for that number to hold up over time? And if you want to actually understand money without all the comfortable shortcuts, you can stick around, because most advice sounds good until you actually run the math behind it. Which means if you're still thinking in terms of just hitting a number, you might want to go back and rethink what that number actually represents. Because the market doesn't really care about your goals, it only responds to how your money actually behaves, whether you understand it or not. So before you move on, just ask yourself what number you're trusting right now, and whether you've actually pressure tested it against how money behaves when things don't go perfectly. And if you want to actually understand money instead of just guessing your way through it, subscribe. Because most people don't fail from lack of effort, they fail from trusting the wrong assumptions.